Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am Julie Woodward with the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Wildlife and Managed Forest webinar. The webinar will focus on managing wildlife trees in the Pacific Northwest and retaining structures through harvest. The webinar is a production of the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, and OFRI's mission is to support and enhance Oregon's forest products industry by advancing public understanding of forests, forest management, and forest products. The Wildlife and Managed Forest Program provides education and outreach to help landowners and managers understand how to intentionally manage forests for both wildlife habitat and sustainable forestry. A few of you have probably been on Zoom and are very familiar with it, but many of the features can be accessed from the toolbar. Just to let you know, your audio and video is turned off for all the participants. The written questions, we appreciate you putting those in the Q&A box. If you just push on that button, you can type in your questions for our speakers today. There will be information posted in the chat about resources. Please don't put your questions in the chat. Please put those in the Q&A box. This webinar will be recorded today and available for free to the public, and it'll be archived as a YouTube video and be accessible from the Know Your Forest website. So thanks again for joining us today, and I'm excited to have our host, Fran Cafaretta-Coe. Fran is the owner of Cafaretta Consulting and is a certified wildlife biologist and OFRI's contract biologist for the Wildlife and Managed Forest Program. So Fran, thanks for hosting today, and I'm looking forward to learning more about our managing wildlife leaf trees in the Pacific Northwest.
Thanks, Julie. I appreciate the introduction. Happy to be here today. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We are super excited to bring you our newest publication in the Wildlife and Managed Forest series. And it's really, it's a little bit different than some of the other ones that you've seen us do. This one is more of a brochure and really addressing those retained structures. I think that it's probably one of the questions that I get most when I'm out boots on the ground with folks is, where do we leave our required wildlife trees? How do we manage for those? So the goal of this publication is to do that, is to figure that out, summarize the research, and provide management guidelines for everyone to use. So before I launch into some of the definitions, I'm going to set the stage for how we're going to handle today. So I'm going to walk us through the publication a little bit and get everybody on the same page with all of the definitions that we've chosen to use throughout the publication, because you probably saw on the title that we're calling it Retaining Structures Through Time. And I know when I'm out in the woods that we don't really call them retained structures. We call them a lot of other things. So I'm going to go through all those. But before that, I want to introduce our other two speakers. You see them on camera. So first is Dr. Gary Roloff, and he's a professor and chairperson of the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University. He holds a PhD in Fisheries and Wildlife from Michigan State University and completed his undergraduate study in wildlife at the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. And he received his master's in biology from the Eastern Kentucky University and has been studying managed forests and relationships with wildlife for over 25 years. Are we giving those numbers out today? I guess we are. And then Dr. Jake Verschuyl is the Director of Forestry Research in the Western United States and British Columbia for the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement. And he holds his PhD in ecology and environmental science from Montana State University and completed his undergraduate study in wildlife management at Cal Poly Humboldt. And he's been studying managed forest and wildlife relationships in the Pacific Northwest for over 20 years. And both of these two are passionate about forestry and wildlife interactions and how, studying how biodiversity is affected by contemporary forest management. And then I guess I should admit that though I haven't been studying it for over 20 years, I've been boots on the ground with it for over 20 years. So some collective experience here. So I will go ahead and hit the introduction. We're going to really, there's this growing body of research that you're going to hear about today that supports the importance of leaving structures for wildlife through harvest. And that's really the goal of our publication. And it's also important to note that retaining some structures during forest harvest, such as wildlife leaves trees and down wood, is required by law for certain forest harvest activities. So it's one of the reasons that it's so important. Also, retaining these structures it contributes to biological diversity. It's also if your forest that you're managing is certified under the Sustainable Forestry Initiative or under FSC or the American Tree Farm System. These can be important components of that plan. And then just really want to emphasize that there are safety concerns with some of these aspects, but we believe strongly that retaining structures through harvest can be done in a safe way and still provide that benefit for wildlife. And so we're just going to go through some definitions, just really basic, just make sure we're all on the same page. So, what is a wildlife tree? And these can be, they can be trees, green trees, they can be snags in some cases, but they're really what's left behind after a harvest to benefit wildlife. And then a snag can be divided into a couple of different things. And I actually do get this question a lot. People are like, hey, I don't know what a snag is. And that is a standing dead tree. And they are voluntary to leave, but they can be counted for wildlife trees depending on the situation. And then we also kind of divide that into two categories. You can have a high stump, which is a lot of times what I suggest leaving behind if safety is a concern, and that just is just retaining part of the tree during harvest. And that's typically less than 10 feet tall. And then a created snag, we always want those as tall as we can possibly get them. They're usually created mechanically or sometimes by tree climbing, but taller than 15 feet. And then legacy trees, if any of you have heard me give any presentation anywhere, anytime, I really get into legacy trees. They're the ones that have been, persisted through the landscape through time. So has survived a catastrophic forest fire, survived a windstorm, survived a timber harvest. They're the bigger trees on the landscape. They're often worth, probably nothing at the mill, incredibly valuable for wildlife. And anyone who knows me knows that I want those retained on the landscape as much as possible. But that's what we're talking about with legacy trees. And then downwood. So we're learning a lot more about downwood. And so it's really just what it is. It's dead wood on the forest floor. It is required in Oregon and in Washington for some forest harvest activities. And then we are learning more about, what does that mean? Is it what's the difference between a slash pile and a habitat pile? And there's still some research that needs to be done there. But the way I think of it is slash pile is something that you're potentially going to burn. And a habitat pile you're never planning to burn that. And you're building that with intention for creating habitat for wildlife. So making sure that there's space underneath and piling the smaller pieces on top. So in my mind, nothing that would ever, it shouldn't be burnt if it's going into a habitat pile. And then, so when you get, Julie's putting in and she already put it in there, the link where you can download this publication. And so you can download it and have it online, and it's available to everybody right now. And literally, this is so new, it's being printed as we speak. And so you can pre-order them and get the printed copy. And I suggest you do it because the way we've designed this brochure is that, you'll be able to open it up to a 4-page spread that really walks you through what our intention is for how to retain these structures across the landscape. And so this is just kind of a preview of how that might look. So Gary and Jake are going to take you through the science that backs up our statements here. But we talk about leaving the required trees adjacent to riparian buffers. We talk about leaving them in upland patches. We really drive home the point about leaving snags wherever and whenever you can. And also a similar point about retaining legacy structures on the landscape and also downed wood. And I'll turn it over to you, Jake.
Great, thanks, Fran. So I'm gonna pick up where Fran left off here and paint a little bit of a picture. And for just a moment, instead of staring at a Zoom screen, we can picture ourselves out on a landing in the woods where we'd probably all rather be. And actually where I was just a little bit earlier today in some of these sites. And so when you look into a retention patch like this, you might be thinking about a number of different things as you stare at these particular trees, especially on I guess both photos, but you notice there's a lot of standing timber volume there. So depending on your perspective, you might have an immediate impression of potentially lost timber value in this retention patch. Or if you were planning this harvest, it really might be a greater concern to you what some of the operational constraints were at the time of harvest. Leaving this patch up on the slope certainly led to some different challenges that might have been associated with the harvest itself or with reforestation. But I think Fran already laid out in many different ways that we can also all agree that structural retention has value for wildlife. But exactly how that is defined it can be a little bit tricky. And we'll go into some of the differences in the upcoming slides here. So structural retention has really been left in a variety of different ways across the landscape. And this is just an aerial image that I pulled down from Google Earth in Southwest Washington, Clark County. And this is Department of Natural Resources land. And I pulled this image down because this is an area where retention is really obvious to see. You can see a pattern of retention there where you've got some pretty substantial buffers along the riparian stream corridors. You also have a ton of different aggregated upslope patches of retention all over the landscape. And you also have an area that's been reasonably heavily harvested over the last decade or so, a lot of young stands in this photo. So you see a lot of retention out there, and the way that wildlife is going to use that retention is a product probably of its arrangement, of its aggregation, of what the rest of the landscape looks like, and a number of different factors like that. So we anticipate that wildlife use of structural retention is going to depend on a number of different things. And one of those is the texts on or wildlife species group of interest. Are we talking about birds? Are we talking about small mammals or other taxonomic groups and how they use that? Or maybe some wildlife that range a little bit more widely than that and really use a broader landscape. Also, the type, the amount, the distribution of that retention, as we looked at that photo there, you can kind of get a sense of what that might look like in one scenario. But the age of the regenerating stand around the retention, those were all really young stands around those patches. And then the adjacent stands and that broader landscape context that I mentioned. Is this adjacent to a contiguous block of federal forest, for example, or potentially in the checkerboard portion of the landscape? And then abiotic factors, which is really just a fancy way of saying place. Place matters. Is it a productive, lower, valley bottom site? Is this a ridgetop, a near alpine situation with maybe a different tree species composition as well? And all of that is going to factor into how wildlife use retention that you leave behind at the time of harvest. And so we've got some other interesting as you scan around Oregon, and I don't know if you all have done this, I always get a kick out of looking at some of these different areas. This is federal forest up the Umpqua River, and this is an aerial image of the demonstration of ecosystem management options or demo study that took place probably about between 10 and 20 years ago now up on federal lands, and it replicated in a few different sites. And you can see these harvest units really, some of them look like dice. They were circular patches of trees left behind, sometimes 5 per harvest unit, or sometimes a circular patch cut in an otherwise contiguous stand. And even those thin stands that you can see there on the right were part of the replication for this study. And a number of different studies have come before the ones that Gary and I are going to describe to you today. And some of them have either more or less application for private managed forest lands as well. And so these treatments on these different studies, the photo on the right here was from Western Forest Products Crown tenure. So this is just north of the Canadian border up in Powell River, British Columbia. And you can see here another example where the treatments were a variation in the total amount of retention. So 5%, 10%, 30% retention. A control and then a complete even age management or clear cut stand. And oftentimes in these prior experimental studies, there's been a heavy focus on the aesthetics as well as societal acceptance of different total quantities of retention, per acre densities of retention left behind at the time of harvest. And depending on the design of these different studies, there can be limited application for more production focused forest landscapes. And Fran mentioned this already, but retention is a requirement in Oregon. And so we really already have some guidance on how applied research can deliver the greatest benefit to land managers in Oregon, because the quantities of required structural retention at the time of harvest have already been defined. And you can see those down there at the bottom, or find them in the Oregon Forest Practices Rules or the illustrated handbook that OFRI has put together. And so generally, we can all agree that there is retention, or there is wildlife value for this structural retention, which obviously covers many of those categories that Fran discussed of leaf trees and snags and downwood. And we now know it's required in state forest practices rules at the time of harvest. And yet what is in the literature to guide a manager on exactly how to retain that, where to put it, whether it should be aggregated or dispersed. A lot of the literature is actually focused on non-standard quantities and aggregations of retention. And so to better understand how to maximize the value of required retention at the time of harvest, we really needed to focus on two things. And one of those was to better understand the total quantity and arrangements of retention that already exist across managed forest landscapes in Oregon, and also to carry out a study that then uses retention treatments that are informed by past research, but also represent quantities and arrangements of retention that are driven by state forest practices rules and also operational constraints. And so from that point, I'm going to turn it over to Gary, and he's going to describe some of the results of some past and just recently completed research that we've worked on in collaboration.
Super, thanks, Jake, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be joining you this afternoon and excited about sharing some of the work that we've conducted in conjunction with others that helped inform the OFRI brochure. You know, over my career, I get asked two questions by foresters real commonly. Tell me what you want, how much you want, and where you want it. And as Jake suggested, the forest practices rules inform that first question, right? How much do we want? But we really never had a good answer for where do you want it? And as I kind of advanced in my career, I thought, you know what, that'd be a really good research question. I didn't think it would take me 25 years to get some answers, but that's the question that really spurred a lot of my interest in this topic. And what I want to do today is just share some high-level results. I want to let you know that all of the results I present today are in the peer-reviewed literature, and I'm happy to share those publications for those of you that might have an interest. But my goal today is to keep this really high level and point out general patterns and observations that kind of thread through all of the work that we've done up to this point. And as Jake suggested, one of the first things we sought to understand is, well, let's just take a look across these landscapes at what's being left. What does it look like? What are the structures that are just kind of being left by default, if you will, under current forest practices rules? And what you have here on the left is, as I'm sitting here looking at this graphic, I was like, oh, it's probably not a good one to start with, but let me walk you through it. So we have diameter on this axis. So, you know, that's what, 20 inches or so. This is in centimeters. So figure that's about 20 inches in diameter. And these different lines represent different types of structures that we found throughout the Southern Oregon landscape. And we worked just west of Roseburg to give you some landscape context. And if you look at the wildlife green trees that are left, that's the solid black line here. And the solid line represents trees that were left standing out alone, not part of a patch. And as you might expect, those are skewed pretty small, right? Yeah, we've got a few big ones up here, you know, up where we get to what, 35 inches diameter, but most of our retention trees are pretty small. And you'd expect that in an industrial managed forest landscape. That same pattern held true for the black dashed line. These are the leaf trees that were in patches. Same general pattern, pretty small trees that we're retaining. The gray bars represent the snags that we encountered. So these are the standing dead trees. Again, the solid line are individuals, and you can see we're providing much larger snags, individual snags, but a lot of those are those legacy structures that Fran mentioned earlier. So as those are those big, the cedars that last, 200 years that have managed to persist across the landscape. And we see kind of a similar pattern with the snags in patches, but a little bit smaller distribution. I think the point is we had a lot of structures to work with that were in this landscape. I was somewhat surprised by the number of structures we encountered in landscapes that have been managed through 2 or sometimes 3 rotations. So I think it attests to the fact that the foresters and the loggers have been paying attention to this and leaving some of these structures through multiple rotations, which is good. When we look at, make sure I don't advance this too far. There we go. When we look at the down wood that is out in the southern Oregon landscape, the take-home message here is that most of the volume is contained in really large pieces. And again, that's this legacy wood that's been left on the landscape. It only takes a couple of pieces of that really big stuff to have high volumes of it. So that's a real critical piece of the current landscape that we're likely losing over time, right? We're not adding that piece back in for the most part. So that's what current conditions look like. So when we started looking at how animals responded to what was left out there, one of the first studies we looked at were birds, the bird community. And this initial work, it occurred across 4 different regions of the Pacific Northwest. And I have those color coded as to how they appear in these graphs. And one of the things I want to point out is how you see these numbers of species, that's on this axis, tree count is on the x-axis. Notice how those lines kind of flatten out at about 15 trees in a patch. What that's telling us is that if you keep adding trees beyond 15, you're not adding a lot of bird species to that stand. So when you get to see the brochure that is being printed today, you'll see that number 15 in that brochure. And that number is based on this observed pattern we saw repeated across all of these regions in the Pacific Northwest on bird species richness. That same pattern generally held true if we look just at forested birds. So the fact that we were able to show that across multiple regions and across different groups of birds make us feel pretty confident that if you're going to leave wildlife leave trees in a patch, your best bet is to leave at least 15 trees clumped together, because that seems to be the sweet spot for birds. Got a little delay here in my, I knew that would happen. I want to just spend a few minutes on this. Was another really interesting finding from that work. Looking at birds again, some of you might be wondering, well, how far away from the adjacent forest should these patches be arranged for birds to use them? And one of the things you'll pick up on generally in these results is that the distance away from the forest edge really didn't matter. You see a little bit of a taper off once you start approaching 400 meters away. but generally the bird community was insensitive to how far these patches or these retained structures were away from the adjacent forest edge. That's not to say that that distance isn't important. What I think we're seeing here is an artifact of limitations on harvest unit size, right? We've been kind of ratcheting down our harvest unit sizes over time. And as a result, this variable, how far you are from the forest edge, or the importance of that variable, has diminished to forest birds. So when we kind of looked at the past research and that initial study that we conducted, we learned a few things. We learned that small patches for birds were generally better than individual trees that were scattered throughout the harvest unit. As Jake alluded to, structure depends on landscape context. So is it down by the riparian zone, upslope? What's going on around the stand? Is it all mature forest around the stand, or is it, you know, adjacent clear cuts? That all matters with how wildlife use these structures. And we also found that there's actually quite an abundant supply of legacy structures out there. But again, we recognize that that's an element of this equation that's not being replaced over time. So we embarked on another set of questions. And we really wanted to try to control for where the trees were placed and how that might be used to optimize or maximize wildlife use. And, you know, I think that quote in this slide is really important, because every forester probably asks that question: what do you get for what we leave behind? So we had already shown that there's a bump in bird species richness, that birds were responding, or these forest patches were helping retain the bird community in an industrial forest landscape. But we wanted to go a little further. So what we did is we set up a manipulative study where we actually controlled the harvest and how patches or structures were retained in these harvest units. One of our treatments was to pile all of the retention trees, which are the light orange colored trees, adjacent to the riparian zone. We kind of viewed that as our control because that's generally what it's a common practice throughout the region, right? So that's kind of what's going on now, and we wanted to test whether that was the best way to structure retention. We took those retention trees and we put them all upslope. That was another treatment that we call upslope. Oops. We took the required retention trees and we split the number in half, and we put half upslope and half adjacent to the riparian zone. We took that split treatment and we created snags out of half of the retained trees. That's called our split snag treatment. And then what we did is the last treatment was we took our retention trees and we dispersed them throughout the harvest unit as single trees. And we created snags out of half of those. So big manipulative study. This is really hard to do, and I got to take my hat off to Jake for coordinating these treatments across multiple industry partners, throughout multiple landscapes. Pretty impressive study that we were able to pull off. All right, so here's kind of how those treatments, it keeps jumping ahead on me. This slide shows the spatial distribution of those treatments. So we had 10 what we called blocks. So if you count up these little labels here, there's 10 of them there. Our 5 treatments that I just walked everybody through occurred in each block. So those 5 treatments occurred up here. They occurred on Port Blakely. They occurred on Weyerhaeuser ground, et cetera, et cetera. And then we managed to do all the harvesting in a 3-year window between 2012 and 2015. We didn't give any specifications to how the partners should regenerate the stand, right? It was just standard operating practices, and it varied, right? Because ODF's practices could have substantially differed from Weyerhaeuser's practices for regeneration, but we just let that play out the way it would. And we ended up accounting for over 4,000 retained structures as part of this study. So this was a really big effort, really good experimental design. So we should feel pretty good about the results we're getting. And these are just some photos of what the end result looked like. So again, we got our retained structures clumped along a riparian zone, our upslope patches, split where half of them were upslope and half of them were down along the riparian zone. Split where some of those were created snags. You can kind of see the created snags here in this photo. I'm pointing to them with my mouse. And then our dispersed treatment, where we dispersed patches of 15 trees throughout the unit. I might have said earlier these were single trees. They weren't. They were patches of 15 trees, going back to that initial study of 15 trees kind of being the magical number. And then half of those were created snags. So those are our 5 treatments, just a picture of what they looked like. And one of the things that we realized is that wildlife response to these treatments is absolutely linked to what's going on in the understory as well as what's going on in the overstory. And all of you know that birds are a pretty mobile species to study. So we were interested in taking a look at species that might have more localized habitat needs. And what we settled on were small mammals and ground beetles. And the idea here is that these species might exhibit tighter relationships to localized habitat, whereas a bird can, if a bird doesn't like an area, they can just get up and fly to the next stand over. Whereas ground beetles and small mammals have much lower dispersal capabilities, and we thought they might better represent what's going on specifically in patches, outside of patches, and at the stand level. And we looked at a bunch of different metrics. We looked at how common some of these species were. We looked at the richness or the diversity of these groups. And then we also explored what I'll describe a little bit later, some functional diversity metrics. And I'll tell you about what functional diversity means here in a few slides. So a whole bunch of different sampling designs, but this slide kind of captures the gist of what we did to collect information on small mammals and beetles. We set up sampling grids inside retention patches, and then a sampling grid outside retention patches in the clear-cut area. And we allocated equal sampling from across treatments. So here's an upslope retention patch treatment, one big patch upslope. The sampling effort in this treatment equaled the sampling effort in this dispersed treatment. So again, we've got grids inside the retention patch, outside the retention patch. And we trapped small mammals and we sampled beetles. This is an example of a beetle trap over here. And we did this for 3 field seasons, so a pretty extensive effort. So what did we find? So if we looked at the most commonly captured small mammal species, it was really dominated by these three species: deer mice, Townsend's chipmunks, and creeping voles. Deer mice, habitat generalist, right? You'd expect this species to be pretty common across all habitat types. Creeping vole is really an herbaceous species, kind of specialist species. So you would expect this species to be common in recent clear-cut areas that are starting to reflush. And then Townsend's chipmunk, you know, we were kind of linking this one to forested conditions, but we actually ended up finding that this species is has a close affinity to downed wood, and not so much the forest cover over its head. And we caught a whole bunch of species. They're all listed here, and you know we've got some shrews in here. We've got some ground squirrels in here, jumping mice. There's an ermine. But what our analysis ended up focusing on were these three commonly collected species. So those are the three we'll talk about in this presentation. So for this general list, as you would predict, we found a similar abundance of this deer mouse species in harvested areas and retention patches. And if we looked across our treatments, deer mice were least common in the upslope aggregated treatment. So that was a knock against upslope aggregated treatments. As you would predict for creeping voles, we found creeping voles in greatest abundance in the clear-cut areas. And this species was most abundant in the upslope aggregated treatment. So exact opposite of deer mouse. And then for Townsend's chipmunk, we found the highest abundance of this species in the patches. And for this species, we actually found highest abundance in that dispersed treatment where the retention patches were spread out all across the stand. And one of the big factors driving that pattern was that a lot of our retention trees blew over and created downwood in those dispersed upland treatments. And I'll show you some data on that in a few slides. All right, I'm going to walk you through this slide because there's some important take homes here. Here's our treatments on the x-axis. So here's our riparian aggregated treatments, our dispersed treatments, and then note that we also sampled adjacent rotation aged forests. So this is the stuff ready for harvest. Start by looking at these yellow lines, because what the yellow bars represent are the stand level effects. So this is combining the retention and the clear-cut plots together and talking about what's going on at the whole stand. And if you just look at these yellow bars, it suggests that riparian and split retention provide the greatest small mammal species richness across our treatment types. So we get about on average 6.6 small mammal species using riparian aggregated retention, 6.1 using split. Our lowest treatment was the aggregated upslope. That only provided habitat or was used by an average of 4.7 small mammal species. However, I note that all of the treatments supported greater small mammal species richness compared to the rotation age forest. Now let's look at the green bars. These are the retention patches. And you see a similar type of message emerging, right? Where our riparian and our splits tended to outperform the upslope and the dispersed, although not as strong of signal. And then the clear cut is the gray bars. These are the clear cut areas of the units. Really no effect across the different treatment types in the clear cuts. So take home message from this slide is there's some support for aggregating the retention in the riparian zones if small mammal species richness is what you're trying to accomplish. I don't want to click this too many times because of the delay here. Let's see. Yep, I knew it. All right, let me talk a little bit about the beetle work. So I mentioned this idea of functional diversity, and what that represents is that each species has evolved over time to live in its environments. So it's evolved specialized structures that allow it to persist in certain environments. These structures, like the type of nest they build, how long their wings are, how long their tail feathers might be, how long their tails might be, how big their ears are, all of these different things describe how that animal functions in its environment. So for the beetles, one of the things we looked at was overall body size, and then how the mandibles are structured, or the jaws are structured, because ground beetles have actually very specialized jaws depending on their diet. So some of these jaws are designed to eat snails, whereas other ones are designed to just eat seeds. So here's a species that has a pretty formidable jaw set. I think this is one of the snail eaters, actually. Whereas another species, you might barely be able to see the jaws. So they have very different functional roles in the ecosystem. And the idea is if you have a real high functional richness or functional diversity, that's a good thing in the ecosystem. That's what you're striving for, right? Because then you have a lot of different functions going on. So we looked at this mandible functional trait in our beetles. And again, we plotted them out by our treatment types across the x-axis. This time we've got rotation age over here on the left-hand side. So keep that in mind. But here's our riparian upslope, our split treatments, and our dispersed. Clear cut are the circles. Patches are the triangles. And as you can see, we found greater functional diversity in beetles communities in our riparian patches. So again, a little more support for grouping our retention along the riparian zones if we want to maximize functional species richness for ground beetles. So a little more evidence for supporting grouping trees along riparian zones. And then here's another little look at the different kind of twist to the beetle data. And this is actually looking at the entire community and how similar or dissimilar the beetle community as a whole is across our treatments. And when we threw all the species together and just looked at beetle community diversity, we really didn't find a treatment effect. It was pretty consistent across all our treatments, except for the dispersed treatment was an underperformer. So when you pull all of that together, there's a few take-home messages that appear in the OFRI brochure. We tended to find more species of small mammals in harvested stands than rotation age forest. And the interesting thing to me with that finding was how quickly the small mammal communities recolonized recently harvested areas. It's uncertain where the sources are for these communities, but the recolonization process was surprisingly quick. So that's another area of research, is how this larger landscape functions to recolonize so rapidly recently harvested areas. We tended to shy away from recommending upland aggregated retention because it just did not perform equal to riparian aggregated retention for small mammals and ground beetles. And then we also found that the retention patches bring greater beetle functional diversity than the harvested area. So these retention patches for ground beetles seem to perform almost like a refugia function in clear-cut harvest units. And we tended to find, maybe more specialized species, not significantly different, but more special. That was significantly different, more specialized species in the retention patches compared to the clear-cut areas. So it points to the importance of the retention patch. And then generally the dispersed retention was a loser. In the case of beetles, it was less beetle diversity for the entire stand. And that general pattern tended to hold true across small mammals, except for that chipmunk that liked the dispersed treatment. So one of the questions we are constantly faced with, well, if you leave these patches, do they last? How long do they stay standing? And fortunately, we were able to collect some data on that. Here's kind of a before and after, before on the left, after on the right. And when we looked at the percent of originally upright trees that ended up being horizontal or blowing over, here's where you can see the dispersed retention treatment was a real loser. So almost 50% on average of the dispersed retention trees blew over. And I think a forester would tell you that you put these trees that have grown in a closed canopy situation and you expose them on a slope to winds, that's going to happen. So if one of your goals is to keep these retention structures vertical, upright, there's a real advantage into grouping them together in the riparian or upslope zones. That's not to say that this horizontal structure is not important, right? Remember, our chipmunks really keyed in on this treatment, this dispersed treatment, and we think it's because there was just an abundance of down wood as a result of wind throw. There were a few surprises that emerged from our work. We actually expected a little bit better performance from the upland aggregated retention than we saw for the small mammals. We thought maybe those upland patches would function as little mini refugia that would hold on some of the more forest dependent species. And we just didn't pick up on that. It didn't show up for small mammals. It surprised us that the chipmunk, the forest associated species, was more common in that dispersed retention. But again, we think what we're seeing there is a response to that abundance of down wood. And that really attracted the chipmunks to that particular treatment type. And this, of course, as any research, it leads to more questions, right? And I think there's still some really good questions to be answered. I'm really interested in how these patches function as the stand grows up around it. I've often thought that by retaining these structures, we might get older forest conditions more quickly as the stand regenerates around it. That's a hypothesis that I think warrants to be tested or looked at. We really didn't look at the created snag issue with the work I did. We have the ability to do that, but that's an unanswered question. Are we getting any bump in cavity nesting birds, for example, by creating snags as part of these treatments? We have a little bit of data on structure longevity, but our stands at the time we sampled them were 5 to 8 years old or so, somewhere in that area. So keeping track of how long these structures persist over time is an important question. And then a big unknown, but I think it's something that NCASI is currently working on, is the influence of fire and how fire treated stands might compare to clear-cut treated stands and if the same patterns would emerge. And I think at this point, I turn it back over to you, Fran. So thank you.
Yeah, great job, Gary. Thank you for that. It occurred to me as Jake and Gary were presenting that we said in the beginning with our intro that we had over, I guess if you combined all our years of experience there, we have like over 60 years of combined experience thinking about this particular topic. And we whittled it down to 2 sentences in the brochure that everyone is able to download and get a printed copy of. And I'm not sure what that means, but if you look on page 4 of the brochure, we really did summarize things up when you get that to how to best leave wildlife, leave trees. So, and I know we're going to have some questions about that, but what you're looking at here on this slide is really the back cover of the publication. And so we thought this would really help folks who might be kind of new to, or all of us to the planning process, and how are we, we've established through this research and through the publication how important it is to leave these structures for wildlife. And so if you're thinking about how to put that into a management plan, this is a good place to start. So I'm not gonna read these to you. You can download it or get them when you order a printed copy, but it does ask you things like, can I leave a wildlife tree patch around an existing snag? How big is my harvest unit? Is there, have I considered where to put the wildlife trees? Have I talked to the logging operator and asked for his opinion or her opinion on how to best do this operationally? Have I considered safety in my plan? Will the retained structures be in locations that allow for future forest management activities? So it'll walk you through kind of all the things. One of my favorite questions in it is, are you leaving a purpose-built habitat pile? Or, how are you managing your slash? And it'll just walk you through all the concepts that we've outlined in the publication. And then, in any of our OFRI pubs, we always try and help you understand what critters might be benefiting from the actions that you're taking on the ground. So we've took some screenshots here of some of the other things that you'll find in the publication. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions, and we do have a few. And so, and then you can also see on here that you've got my email and Jake's and Gary's. And so we are available for questions, and when it's over and you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot to ask that one I really wanted to ask, you can come back to us and we will do our best. So, and I'm just going to ask them, Jake and Gary, and you guys can either decide, or if you're like, I don't know, then you can tell me that it's my turn and I'll be happy to answer them also. But so one of the questions we have is about the Oregon State regulations. And I think we have a slide on that. And it wants, this person would like to know if there's any, do the state regs talk about the species of tree that should be retained? And so there aren't any, right? There's no guidelines on the species. I don't know if probably can't get back to that slide, but do either of you want to take a stab at any recommendations on that?
I don't think there's any guidance on species, but there is guidance on a mix of broadleaf and conifer, right, Fran? I believe it's no more than 50% deciduous, and so you can leave, alder and maple and other trees like that as long as they meet the minimum DBH requirement. Up to 50% of your total leave trees, I believe.
And then, so the OFRI Illustrated Manual has a great description of those rules. And I think, Julie just posted the link to that. It's even on page 38. Do you have any of your favorites that you would leave if it was your ground?
I'm going to jump into ground that Gary may have input on as well, but in general, vegetative diversity leads to other taxonomic groups diversity. So it kind of trickles through the different different functional characteristics. Gary talked a little bit about that, about seed eaters. If you're going to have a greater variety of seeds in your stand, you're going to have a greater variety of seed eaters, and so on and so forth. So I think if there are patches with greater tree species diversity or a more robust understory, those might be places to center your leaf tree patch. And that's not something that we talk about a lot, about what does the understory look like in a patch, but I think that's that's pretty important too. And some of these patches that have a robust shrub understory to them can be pretty valuable.
Yeah. Gary, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, that's perfect. I couldn't have said it better.
Awesome. All right. Well, how about this one for you then, Gary? Is ground beetle activity affected by daylight heat or nighttime coolness?
Oh, you know what? So we collected data on that, and I'm trying to recall what the results were on that. That we definitely saw a seasonal effect on capture probability. Gosh, you're testing me here, but I think our capture probability declined as it got really hot and dry. But don't quote me on that. Let me consult the pub on that. But I think that you're onto something there. There's definitely a capture probability effect related to weather, and we did try to account for that in our modeling. So.
Okay, so I'm going to read this question to you. The study does a great job of studying species diversity and functional guilds. Do you have any insights on individual species, especially specialists, and whether or not the recommended strategies will work across the board? Maybe specifically thinking about bluebirds or swallows that nest in snags in open areas, but that question could apply to a lot of different species.
Well, I can talk a little. Jake's probably the bird expert on that question, but I can talk a little bit about the mammal community. We actually saw some specialist species, small mammal species and beetle species, but I'll focus on small mammals using our harvested stands. We had some flying squirrels in some of our stands, usually associated, I think always associated with riparian retention. We found wood rats in some of our stands, and it's unclear if the wood rats were kind of just legacies from the previous stand, or if they would persist over time in our patches. We tended to capture those in retention patches, for example. It's kind of just a few examples that really don't answer the question, but I think there's potential there to design retention to focus on specific species that might be specialists and take into account the life history needs of those species when you're designing the retention practices. Jake, what do you got to add from birds or anything else that you might have there?
Yeah, it's interesting being out in some of these stands with the created snags just this morning in a couple of different blocks, and there isn't a single patch with created snags 7 years in now that doesn't have cavity nesting bird use in those created snags. So we were seeing, all sorts of chickadees and woodpeckers and flickers and such using those created snags. The window of time for bluebirds and swallows, it's kind of an interesting, these created snags take a little bit of time to decay before they're useful for the primary cavity nesters, those that are going to excavate the cavities. And then obviously you'd have to get the secondary cavity nester in there to get to the bluebird and swallow level. So you've got a little bit of time. And during that period of time in these stands, the regenerating stand is growing almost to the point where you're getting out of that early, more meadow-like stage that's heavily used by bluebirds and swallows. So I'm not sure that the timing is going to line up just right for the bluebirds and swallows to use the created snags. So if you were interested in those two species, they will readily arrive to any nest boxes that you add out there. And I know that may not be operationally feasible across large landscapes, but maybe there are some smaller woodland owners here that certainly following harvest on the perimeter of your structural retention patch, if you had boxes up there, they would be using those.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So we have a few questions about the study design. Were the studies done primarily in Douglas fir forests?
Go ahead, Jake. You set that all up, so yeah.
Yeah, pretty much exclusively. There were some of these stands that had some planted hemlock as well as Douglas fir, but we were pretty solidly in the Douglas fir zone, both sides of the Willamette Valley and up to about Mount St. Helens in Washington. Some of our very near coastal blocks, far southwestern Washington, probably had more hemlock than Douglas fir. But stands that were replanted, were generally around 400 trees per acre. So pretty standard operational practices there.
And then what about slope and aspect? Were those considered in the retention patches? And if so, how much of a role did they play on the diversity?
That wasn't considered in the design. And we did not account for it in any of the analyses we did.
Yeah, I would say there, just to add to what Gary said, there's, it's replication, right? So in this scenario, each treatment is replicated 10 times. And so it's going to land on a variety of different slopes and aspects. It's part of the blocking feature that you get at, each treatment exists within a relatively discrete geographic range of, within 5 kilometers or so of each other. But as far as, there are still differences in slope aspect and elevation. And I think you see, that play out in different ways. If you are in a near coastal area, you might see some of those south slopes be more productive than north slopes. But if you're in a drier, hotter zone in the toe slope of the Cascades, you might see north slopes hold on to a greater diversity of vegetation longer throughout the year. And all of that's going to play into how our different wildlife species use it.
Yeah, we did not talk about the vegetation data that were collected as part of this either. We had a botanist do a bunch of vegetation work. And if I remember those results correctly, I was surprised by the lack of differences among the sites, because I thought we'd see a bigger, and maybe I'm characterizing that wrong, Jake, but I don't think we saw a huge amount of difference in the veg communities, did we?
Yeah, it paralleled a little bit what we found in small mammal species richness, in that, there was greater vegetative diversity in and along patches that were left adjacent to the riparian. And I kind of perceived the mechanism there being greater water availability and a summer drought tolerance defined plant community, if that makes sense. So your plant community is developing based on its drought tolerance, and maybe that's less of a factor down along the riparian zone for some of these sites.
I think you kind of got into this next question a little bit with that, but we had a question about what is the effect of the treatments on the ground flora that was studied, especially getting back to the 15 tree patch. So we would assume maybe a larger patch than 15 trees would be required to optimize, with those edge effects and the interior abiotic conditions. Did you look at that at all? How was that accounted for?
I did not look at it, but we have the data. And I'm not sure what the status of that analysis is. Jake, you might know better.
Yeah, it's still ongoing, but I mean, I can share basically that those dispersed patches, and especially once half of those standing leaf trees were turned into created snags, have not a whole lot of canopy left. So half of them turned into created snags, and then 50% of the remaining ones fell over, right? So there wasn't that much of a patch left. But like Gary mentioned, there was still quite a bit of value that we were seeing from some species in terms of the use of downwood. But the vegetation in there in the understory began to look a lot like it did in the rest of the harvest unit.
Yeah. And in our larger patches, being in those, the understory plant communities definitely differed than the clear cuts for sure.
Yeah.
We retained some of those characteristics with some of our larger retention patches. But they're not particularly diverse, right? So it's you're leaving a rotation age mature forest that has a pretty sparse ground layer to begin with. So that's what we saw, that condition kind of persisting. And you maybe got a little bit of flush around the edges, of course, when there's sunlight hit the forest floor. But
you really talked about in your studies about the, that 15 tree requirement. And I like that you said at least 15 trees. Is there a benefit to leaving more than 15, like kind of outside of the bounds of your study? What advice would you give folks on the ground?
Yeah, for birds, as you get bigger retention patches, you can add a few species here or there. But if you're really looking to kind of optimize your leaf trees and where you get your biggest bang for your buck, that 15 was the sweet spot. You still get a little bit of an increase as you continue to grow the patch size. So maybe you eventually pick up a rare species or something that might come in and settle in that retention patch. So, I think the general premise that bigger is better tends to hold true, but at least 15 is critical.
Mm-hmm. And then what about single leaf trees? Like is your studies kind of showed that maybe they weren't as useful for in this situation, but is there any benefit to leaving single leaf trees across the landscape? What if they're, like, for instance, what if they're legacy trees?
Oh, I think leaving it all legacy trees we can is absolutely critical, even if it's standing out there all by itself, because those structures, they almost kind of take on and they create an environment of their own, right? They're so big, they hold moisture longer into the growing season, and you'll find organisms, it's like a little mini micro community inside of those things that are really important for landscape level diversity. So legacy structures, I think, are absolutely critical to protect, regardless of the spatial configuration. Individual leaf trees, we only looked at that with the first study I talked about. Birds perch in them, right? Raptors hunt from them. There's value there, but if you're really looking at trying to conserve a bird community, for example, this is, Fran, where maybe you and I differ. I think there's better ways to do it. There's bigger bangs for your buck rather than leaving individual rotation age trees across a landscape.
No, I think we're aligned, Gary. I
Okay.
think that what I wanted to hear you say, and these weren't questions from the community, by the way, these were mine. That I wanted to hear you say about that, like, if that single tree is a legacy tree, then let's keep it. And I'm on board with, if it's if we can leave these groups of 15, then let's do that. Let's make an impact where we can have the biggest impact. I think that's absolutely spot on.
Yeah.
We do have a few students in the audience, which I am so glad. That's just fantastic. And so we've got a question from wondering about how you collected the data on the squirrels. How did you do that? Did you trap them? What was your, how?
Yep. You can see there's actually in that photo right there, there's a flying squirrel in one of our live traps. So we use tomahawk live traps, and we actually had 2 traps. Tomahawks and Shermans are 2 types of small mammal traps, baited with seeds and with some batting in there. You can see the cotton batting to help them thermoregulate. And, we ran these trap lines, which is a huge, for those of you that have trapped small mammals or trapped anything, you get a sense for how huge of effort that is to do that. If you're going to treat the animals well, in terms of an animal welfare standpoint, and do good studies, it's a huge effort. So.
And to that student, if you can get a field job doing small mammal trapping, I would recommend it. It was one of my first jobs, and it was awesome. I do see some gloves in here. I got to the point, I don't know about anybody else, but I got to the point where I just wore fingerless gloves and would reach in. It didn't matter what was in the trap, and just grab whatever it was. And they would tend to just grab onto, they're probably not allowed to do that anymore. You probably have to wear like all kinds of stuff, but I just, like, my bare fingers would grab them, and they just would cling to that wool. And then you could put the little ear tags in them or whatever, and then just let them go. I did get bit a few times, but not often.
Yeah.
It's fun. It's fun work.
You haven't lived until you've been bit by a ground squirrel.
Yeah. Well, ground squirrels, I still remember my boss. He's like showing me how we're going to deal with a ground squirrel. And this was Dave Waldine. He got all the tools out, set them all out. We got to the ground squirrel, and he just opened the trap and let it go. He's like, yeah, no, we don't do anything with those. But speaking of small mammals, so I do have one more question here about small mammals. I can kind of feel like, I know some of the audience, we've got a lot of our forestry community with us today, a lot of our friends and colleagues, and small mammals can be a concern for a regenerating stand. I think my dad affectionately calls them the clippers and nippers that can come in and really do some damage to those. So it's a good species to pick for this. I'm not sure that maximizing habitat for small mammals is on the list for some of our land managers. So do we have any, and I'd have to think about this some, but do we have any recommendations for how we might mitigate that? Like if we, for we're kind of under these new forest practice rules coming out, being required to leave more trees in the riparian buffers as it is. And so we may be, creating quite a bit of small mammal habitat. What are our thoughts on how we might manage that?
Yeah, so I guess I would then, if small mammal depredation on seedlings, for example, is a concern, I would gravitate towards the retention strategy that we showed the lowest small mammal abundance and structure to, or species richness to, which I believe was the dispersed. I got to go back and check through my notes here. I think it was the dispersed treatment.
Mhm.
Or you could put the other spin on it and pile all your retention trees in the riparian zone and try to keep your mammals down by the riparian zone so the rest of your stand can grow. So,
Right.
yeah.
And then maybe if you have some of those created snags, make sure you put some of those raptor perches we were talking about.
There you go. Yeah.
It's good. It would be good to know who your snippers and nippers are, right?
Yes.
So make sure that you're targeting the right mix of species to be able to maintain diversity. If Townsend's chipmunks aren't an issue, then no need to manage against them.
Right.
Obviously, we've got other things that we didn't sample a lot, like mountain beaver, that can be a real problem, but that wasn't in our data in a meaningful way.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. If the voles are the snippers and clippers, you got problems, right? Because they respond best to the clear cut. So
It's it just drives home the point that there's any action that we take out there is going to have a response from the wildlife community that's there, and so don't always get necessarily the response that you're looking for, but you're guaranteed to get some kind of response. Well, that was an amazing presentation to have all that research back up the statements that are made in this new brochure. We hope everybody will order a copy of it, and just thank you for being here with us today. I don't think there's any more questions. Do either of you have any parting thoughts you'd like to give before we wrap up?
no, I just extend my thanks to the NCASI, OFRI, the industry partners. It's just been an absolute delight working with all of you for the last 20 some years. And I just appreciate the opportunity. I think we did some good work. I think we did some good applied work that answers some important questions, but also recognize there's more work to do. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Same echoing from my perspective, and also just stay tuned for some bird results out of this same study, and don't hesitate to use those emails on the screen to reach out if you have questions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much again for your presentation today, and thank you everybody for participating. And we'll see you at the next one.